A real-life unsolved murder from history, a young life cut short, a body sinking into the icy Seine. The drowned may find rest in the riverbed's embrace, but when will the torrent of slander cease violating the dead's dignity? Hi, this is Midnight Corridor. Tonight we are going to read The Mystery of Marie Rogêt by Edgar Allan Poe. In the perpetual twilight of a Parisian autumn, where the dying light cast long shadows upon cobblestoned streets, there dwelt a man whose mind possessed an almost supernatural faculty for penetrating the veils of human deception. See Auguste Dupin, that enigmatic figure whose very name had become synonymous with the most profound analytical reasoning, sat in his chamber of contemplation, surrounded by the ephemeral whispers of newsprint and the spectral remnants of human tragedy. Before him lay scattered the daily chronicles of human folly and misfortune, newspapers bearing the weight of society's most perplexing mysteries. Among these lay the accounts of a case that would test even his extraordinary powers of deduction: the mysterious disappearance and tragic death of Marie Rogêt, a young woman of uncommon beauty whose fate had become the subject of intense public speculation and official bewilderment. The tale of Marie Rogêt possessed all the elements of a Gothic romance: beauty destroyed in its prime, love shrouded in secrecy, and death wearing the mask of inexplicable mystery. She had been, by all accounts, a creature of singular loveliness, one of those ethereal beings who seem to walk among mortals as if they were visitors from some more refined sphere of existence. Marie dwelt in the shadow of the great cathedral of Notre Dame, employed at a modest tobacco shop in the narrow Rue Saint-André-des-Arts. The establishment carried the earthy aroma of cured leaves that mingled perpetually with the urban symphony of carriage wheels and street vendors' cries. On that fateful Sunday morning of June 22, 1841, Marie informed her employer that she intended to visit her aunt who resided in the Rue des Drômes. The morning was one of those peculiarly oppressive days that sometimes descend upon Paris like a shroud, when the very air seems thick with unspoken portents and the shadows appear deeper than nature would ordinarily allow. 3 days after Marie's departure, 3 days that stretched like an eternity of foreboding, the Seine yielded up its terrible secret. A fisherman, plying his trade in the early morning hours when the mist still clung to the water's surface like the breath of the damned, discovered floating among the reeds the lifeless form of what had once been Paris's most celebrated beauty. Marie Rogêt is dead. The discovery sent shockwaves through the city's soul, as if the very foundations of civilized society had been shaken by some malevolent force. The newspapers, those chronicles of human misery and sensation, seized upon the story with the voracious appetite of carrion birds, each publication offering its own interpretation of the ghastly discovery. Dupin, reviewing the various newspaper accounts of that morning, noted with particular interest the contradictory nature of the testimonies surrounding Marie's departure. L'Etoile reported that she had seemed in unusually high spirits, while Le Moniteur suggested that witnesses had observed a certain pensiveness in her demeanor. Such contradictions, Dupin mused, were often more revealing than the most detailed eyewitness accounts, for they suggested the presence of those subtle deceptions that invariably accompany human tragedy. Le Moniteur Universel, in its characteristic tone of official solemnity, reported that the body had been found in a state of advanced decomposition, suggesting that death had occurred shortly after the victim's disappearance. The corpse, it noted with clinical detachment, bore evidence of violent struggle, the clothing torn to ribbons, some of which had been used to bind the limbs in a manner that spoke of deliberate concealment rather than random violence. La Presse, ever eager to sensationalize, painted a more lurid picture. The unfortunate young woman's garments were not merely torn, but appeared to have been systematically destroyed, as if by some fiend possessed of methodical malice. The very manner of the binding suggested knowledge of seamanship, leading investigators to suspect the involvement of rivermen or sailors. Yet Le Constitutional offered a markedly different account, describing the knots as peculiar and unlike those commonly employed by maritime professionals, and suggesting instead the work of someone attempting to create the false impression of nautical involvement. Dupin, his pale fingers tracing the lines of newsprint as if they were sacred runes, noted these discrepancies with the keen interest of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. In his experience, such contradictions were not mere journalistic incompetence, but rather the inevitable result of witnesses filtering truth through the distorting lens of their own expectations and fears. L'Étoile provided what it claimed was the most comprehensive account of the crime scene. The deceased was discovered partially submerged among the rushes, her long dark hair streaming like seaweed in the current. About her throat were visible the livid marks of manual strangulation, while her countenance bore the unmistakable expression of one who had experienced the ultimate terror. The same publication noted that several articles of male clothing had been found in the vicinity, fragments of fine cloth that suggested a gentleman's attire. This detail, seemingly insignificant to the casual observer, struck Dupin as profoundly meaningful. If the crime had indeed been committed by a gang of ruffians, as the police theorized, why would evidence point to a single, well-dressed assailant? Le Moniteur reported another curious detail. Marie's bonnet had been discovered some distance from the body, hanging from a thorn bush, as if deliberately placed rather than lost in struggle. The ribbon that had secured it showed no signs of violent removal, but rather appeared to have been carefully untied. As Dupin absorbed these varied accounts, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across his aquiline features, he began to perceive the emergence of a pattern, not in what the newspapers reported, but in what they consistently failed to address. The official investigation, he realized, had been fundamentally misdirected from its very inception. In the days that followed the grim discovery, Paris became a city possessed by speculation and rumor. Every café, every salon, every gathering place resonated with theories as numerous as the stones in Père Lachaise cemetery. Yet, amidst this cacophony of conjecture, Dupin observed with growing fascination how the very abundance of testimony served only to obscure rather than illuminate the truth. Dupin, his analytical mind dissecting these contradictions with surgical precision, recognized in them the hallmarks of manufactured testimony. No genuine witness, he reflected, could produce such wildly divergent accounts unless influenced by external forces. Either Madame Deluc was deliberately providing false information, or she had become the victim of suggestion and coercion. This revelation, if true, would fundamentally alter the nature of the crime. No longer could it be dismissed as a random act of violence perpetrated by waterfront ruffians. Instead, it suggested the possibility of a crime passionnel, that most Gothic of human tragedies, where love and death become inextricably intertwined. L'Étoile, in its continued coverage of the case, published what it claimed was a comprehensive timeline of Marie's final day. According to their investigation, she had left her employer's establishment at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, stating her intention to visit her aunt in the Rue des Drômes. However, when authorities questioned the aunt, she denied any expectation of Marie's visit and insisted that her niece had not appeared at her residence. This discrepancy, seemingly minor, held profound implications. If Marie had not intended to visit her aunt, then her stated purpose had been deliberately deceptive. The question that naturally arose was, whom had she truly intended to meet, and why had she felt compelled to conceal her true destination? Le Moniteur reported that several witnesses claimed to have seen Marie in the company of various individuals throughout that fateful day, but these sightings were so contradictory as to be mutually exclusive. One witness placed her at a riverside cafe at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while another insisted she had been observed at the Palais Royal at precisely the same hour. A third claimed to have seen her boarding an omnibus bound for the suburbs, while a fourth swore she had been walking alone along the quays. As Dupin contemplated these impossible testimonies, he began to perceive the emergence of a darker pattern. It appeared that someone had taken considerable care to ensure that Marie's final movements would be obscured by a web of conflicting accounts. This suggested not random violence, but calculated premeditation. The work of someone intimately familiar with the power of false testimony to misdirect official investigation. In the sepulchral silence of his chamber, surrounded by the accumulated testimonies of human fallibility and official incompetence, Dupin began the delicate process of constructing truth from the fragments of deception. Like an archaeologist piecing together an ancient vase from scattered shards, he understood that the complete picture would emerge not from any single piece of evidence, but from the careful arrangement of seemingly unrelated details. The prevailing theory, enthusiastically embraced by the prefecture of police and echoed throughout the popular press, held that Marie Rogêt had fallen victim to a gang of riverside criminals, rough men who had seized upon her beauty as an opportunity for both pleasure and profit. This theory possessed the appealing simplicity that bureaucratic minds find so comforting. It required no complex investigation into Marie's private life, no delicate inquiries into the secrets of respectable society, no uncomfortable questions about the hidden connections between victim and perpetrator. Yet Dupin, with his characteristic penetration, perceived in this very simplicity the hallmark of intellectual laziness. The theory of gang violence, he noted, failed to account for numerous crucial details that had emerged from the various newspaper accounts. If Marie had indeed been attacked by multiple assailants bent on robbery and worse, why had her jewelry remained untouched? If the crime had been committed by waterfront ruffians, why did the physical evidence point to someone familiar with the victim's habits and movements? L'Étoile had reported that Marie's reticule, containing several gold coins and a small diamond brooch, had been found intact near her body. No desperate criminal, Dupin reasoned, would have overlooked such easily portable wealth. This detail alone suggested that robbery had not been the motive, that something far more personal and complex had driven the perpetrator to murder. The manner of Marie's death, as described in the various medical reports published by the press, provided additional clues to the discerning mind. Le Moniteur had noted that death appeared to have resulted from manual strangulation, with the marks upon the throat suggesting the grip of a single pair of hands rather than the multiple assaults one would expect from gang violence. The positioning of these marks, furthermore, indicated that the killer had faced his victim during the struggle, an intimate and personal method of murder that spoke of passion rather than random brutality. La Presse had published the observations of the examining physician, who noted that Marie's fingernails bore traces of human skin and blood, evidence that she had fought desperately against her attacker. Yet the pattern of these defensive wounds suggested a prolonged struggle with a single adversary rather than the quick, overwhelming assault that would characterize an attack by multiple criminals. Perhaps most significantly, the location where Marie's body was discovered provided crucial insights into the nature of her killer. The spot, a secluded bend in the Seine, some distance from the main thoroughfares, was not the sort of place frequented by casual criminals or waterfront gangs. It was, rather, a location that someone familiar with Marie's habits might have chosen for a private meeting, a trysting place known to both victim and perpetrator. Le Constitutionnel had noted that the area where Marie was found showed signs of a prolonged presence. The grass was trampled in a pattern suggesting that two people had remained there for some time before the fatal struggle began. This detail painted a picture not of sudden violence, but of a meeting that had turned deadly. Perhaps when conversation had given way to argument, and argument to irrevocable action. The systematic attempt to obscure Marie's identity and movements, evidenced by the contradictory witness testimonies, suggested a killer who understood the importance of misdirection in avoiding detection. This was not the crude work of common criminals, but the calculated effort of someone possessed of intelligence and social understanding, someone who moved in respectable society and understood how to manipulate its prejudices and assumptions. As these various threads began to weave themselves into a coherent pattern, Dupin felt the familiar thrill of approaching revelation. The truth, he realized, lay not in the sensational theories promulgated by the press, but in the careful analysis of what had been deliberately concealed and systematically distorted. The chamber seemed to grow colder as Dupin's deductions took shape. His fingers traced the edges of the scattered newspapers, each containing fragments of the truth, or perhaps deliberate falsehoods. "Observe," he murmured, his voice barely disturbing the thick silence, "how the evidence arranges itself into two distinct narratives. The newspapers would have us believe in a gang of waterfront ruffians, yet the very contradictions in their accounts betray the fragility of this theory." He lifted a single sheet of newsprint toward the guttering candlelight. The bonnet carefully hung upon a thorn bush, the peculiar knots, not those of sailors but someone imitating sailors, the untouched jewelry. Each detail whispers a different story than what the prefecture proclaims. The chamber seemed to grow colder as Dupin's deductions crystallized into certainty. His long fingers, pale as the wax dripping from the guttering candle, arranged the scattered newspapers into a damning pattern upon the table. He declared, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through cobwebs, how every contradiction in these accounts points unerringly to one conclusion: the peculiar knots, unmistakably the work of a naval man, though clumsily disguised. The fine wool fragments from an officer's frock coat, the location, known only to Marie and her paramour, that recently returned lieutenant of the Navy whose name appears in no newspaper, yet whose presence haunts every line of these reports like a ghost at a séance. Yet, even as he spoke, his voice carried a peculiar hesitation. And yet the matter remains imperfect. Without the boat, that crucial missing vessel which must have carried Marie's body to its resting place, our conclusions must remain in the realm of conjecture. The firelight cast his shadow, elongated and wavering, across the volumes of criminal cases that lined his walls. We may reconstruct the tragedy thus: a lover's quarrel turned fatal, a panicked attempt to disguise the crime, influential hands steering the investigation away from certain quarters. But the final proof, his hand made an empty gesture in the air. The final proof remains as elusive as the morning mist upon the Seine. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the Parisian rooftops. The case of Marie Rogêt would join those other unresolved mysteries that haunted the city's collective memory, its truth, perhaps, known to a select few, but never to be openly acknowledged. Dupin extinguished the candle, its last wisp of smoke curling upward like a question mark in the gray morning light. Some puzzles, it seemed, were destined to remain unsolved, their answers lost between what could be proven and what the powerful would permit to be known. Till now, the mystery of Marie Rogêt remains, a puzzle without answers, a truth forever out of reach. Edgar Allan Poe didn't just invent detective fiction, he exposed an uncomfortable truth. Some doors remain closed, some names stay unspoken, some crimes are simply allowed to happen. Next time, we'll face an even darker question. What happens when the perfect crime isn't solved because no one wants it to be? The case of the purloined letter awaits. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Make sure you won't miss the next case.